It started as one of those moments people don't think twice about. A crow in the backyard, a broom in Caio's hands, a quick, irritated swing meant to scare it off. No drama, no real harm at first glance. Just a small, ordinary mistake in a neighborhood where birds were as common as barking dogs and late afternoon traffic. Caio barely remembered it afterward. He went back inside. The day kept moving, and for a while, that should have been the end of it. But a week later, the sounds outside had changed. At first it was only a harsh cry cutting across the morning quiet, sharp enough to make him look up from the kitchen window. Then came the flybys, low and fast, black wings flashing overhead like a warning that was somehow meant for him alone. Crows began gathering in the tall tree near the fence, not just perching there, but lingering, shifting, watching. From the street, it looked almost deliberate, almost staged, as if the backyard had become a courtroom and Caio was the one being called to account. What made it worse was the pattern. They never seemed to bother his brother. Never the neighbors. Never the kids riding bikes past the gate or the woman who watered her plants every afternoon. It was always Caio. The moment he stepped outside, the calls would start again. Sometimes one crow, sometimes two, sometimes more. And always that same unnerving feeling. Not random noise, but attention. Caio began filming every encounter on his phone, first out of curiosity, then out of something closer to concern. He replayed the footage at night, zooming in on the tree line, the roof edges, the black shapes arriving and departing like they were exchanging information. The recordings didn't explain much, but they did reveal one thing clearly enough to unsettle him. The birds seemed to know exactly when he was there. That's when the question stopped sounding ridiculous. Was this revenge? A grudge held by birds with better memories than people expected? Or was something even stranger happening, hidden in plain sight above the fences and satellite dishes of an ordinary suburb? If you've ever dismissed a bird as just background noise, this is where the story gets harder to ignore. Because corvids are not simple animals reacting on instinct. They remember, they learn, they recognize individual faces. And sometimes, what they pass along to one another can look a lot like judgment. So how did one broom swing turn into a neighborhood-wide campaign of black-feathered suspicion? And why did it feel, to Caio at least, like the birds had already decided who he was? At first, Caio treated the whole thing like a joke that had gone a little too far. A crow on the fence, a broom in his hands, one bad decision, one sharp wave of annoyance, and then the bird lifted off into the gray afternoon like it had simply been interrupted. But the next morning, something felt off. The yard was too quiet, the branches above the fence too still. Then came the sound, high and rough from the roofline, a call that made Caio look up before he even understood why. By the end of the week, the neighborhood had changed. Not in any dramatic, movie-like way, but in tiny details that were harder to dismiss. A crow would appear on the power line when Caio stepped outside. Another would glide low over the sidewalk, close enough to make him flinch. Then, from somewhere in the jacaranda tree near the corner house, came a gathering of dark shapes, one after another, until the branches held 3, then 5, then 7 birds watching the street with almost unnerving stillness. "They're just birds," his brother told him, half laughing. "You're imagining it." But Caio had stopped laughing. He started filming, first out of curiosity, then from a growing need to prove to himself that he wasn't losing perspective. The camera captured what memory alone could not. A crow turning its head at the exact moment he stepped onto the patio, another answering a call from across the street. The timing so precise it felt less like coincidence and more like coordination. And the strangest part was how selective it seemed. His brother could walk outside without incident. The neighbors came and went. But Caio? Every time he appeared, the birds changed position. Every time he looked up, one seemed to already be looking back. What unsettled him most was the pattern. It wasn't random noise or chaotic nuisance. It felt directed. A warning. A response. The kind of behavior that makes you wonder whether the birds were reacting to his face, his movement, or something deeper that had already been exchanged among them. Because once a crow notices you, it's not always alone in the noticing. Other corvids may learn too. They may listen, observe, and remember what one bird learned the hard way. And that's where the story becomes less about a broom and more about reputation. If a bird can identify a person as dangerous, how long does that judgment last? How far does it spread? Caio didn't have the answers, Only the recordings, the visits that kept repeating, and the uncomfortable feeling that the birds above his house were not simply watching. They were deciding. At first, Caio thought he was imagining it. One crow circling overhead could be a coincidence. Two could be bad timing. But the pattern kept tightening around him. Whenever he stepped into the yard, a shadow moved above the roofline. Whenever he opened the gate, a sharp call cut through the air. It was as if the neighborhood had developed a new language, and Caio had become the subject of every sentence. He began recording everything on his phone, speaking softly into the camera as if the birds might understand. "It's him again," he muttered one morning, keeping his eyes on the power line. "They wait until I come out." His brother laughed at first, then stopped laughing when the crows started gathering in the same jacaranda tree across the street. 6, then 8, then more, all watching in a stillness that felt almost organized. They weren't swarming randomly. They were arriving, returning, learning. The strangest part was how selective it all seemed. Caio's brother could walk to the car without a single dive. The neighbors swept their patios, carried groceries, watered plants, and the crows barely blinked. But Caio? The moment he appeared, the call sharpened. A bird would perch on the fence and tilt its head, as if checking a file. Another would swoop low enough to make him flinch, then rise without touching him. It was not constant aggression. It was attention, measured, specific, and impossible to ignore. That's where the science starts to change the story. Corvids, crows, jays, ravens, magpies, are not simple animals reacting on instinct alone. Studies have shown that they can recognize individual human faces, remember threatening encounters for years, and even spread that information through their social groups. A bird that learns to fear one person may not keep that knowledge to itself. Others can pick it up. The warning becomes collective. And in that light, Caio's fear looks less like paranoia and more like a public record being updated in real time. To a human, a broom is just a broom. To a crow, it may be a message, a threat, a lesson. Once the memory is written, the birds do not need to hate you. They only need to remember. So when Caio finally tried the softer approach, leaving food on a low wall and stepping back with his hands visible, the crows did not come closer right away. They watched. One landed first, then another. They kept their distance, careful, unreadable. Not forgiveness, not peace, something more precise than that. And then one of them gave a single, harsh call from the branch above, as if announcing that the assessment had changed. By the time Caio started filming, the backyard no longer felt like a backyard. It felt watched. Every morning, he would step outside with his phone in one hand and coffee in the other, scanning the fence line, the roof, the power lines. And every morning, the crows seemed to know exactly when he had appeared. One would land first, then another. A few seconds later, the harsh calls would begin, sharp and layered, as if the birds were relaying information across the street, up the block, beyond the visible edge of the neighborhood. At first, Caio tried to laugh it off. "Maybe it's just coincidence," he muttered once, while the camera shook in his hand. But the footage told a different story. The birds did not behave like random visitors. They orbited his house, waiting. They approached low and fast over the yard, then pulled away at the last second, returning to the same tree where several of them would gather and stare down at him with an intensity that was hard to explain away. When Caio stepped outside, the noise changed. When his brother did, the birds stayed quiet. When a neighbor passed by, they barely reacted. But Caio drew a response every time. That was the detail that turned annoyance into something stranger. It wasn't just that the crows were present. It was that they seemed to be distinguishing him from everyone else. In one particularly unsettling clip, Caio is heard whispering, "Why do they only do this to me?" A few seconds later, a crow lands on the fence post directly in front of him and lets out a long, rasping call, almost like a reply. Whether it was coincidence or projection, the effect was the same. The birds had become part of the story, and Caio was no longer sure where instinct ended and recognition began. Scientists have seen this kind of behavior before. Corvids can remember faces, especially the faces of people who threaten them. More than that, they can learn from each other. A bird that identifies a danger may react, call out, and be answered by others who never had the original encounter. In that sense, reputation spreads, not as myth, but as information, not as emotion, but as survival. So when Caio tried to change the pattern, he did something almost disarmingly human. He brought food, not to lure them exactly, more like an apology without words. He placed it near the tree and stepped back, half expecting the flock to scatter. Instead, the crows watched him in silence, heads tilting, bodies still. Then one hopped forward, took a piece, and flew off. Another followed. No celebration, no forgiveness, no dramatic ending. Just assessment. And that may be the most unsettling part. In their world, nothing had to be personal for it to feel deeply directed. They did not need hatred. They only needed memory. They had seen him once, learned something, and adjusted. The question now is not whether the birds can hold a grudge. It's whether they need to. Because if crows can remember, compare, and pass that information along, then Caio is no longer dealing with a single bird in his yard. He's dealing with a network. And that network may already have decided exactly what kind of human he is. By the time Caio stops treating the crows like a nuisance and starts treating them like witnesses, the backyard feels different. He no longer walks outside expecting silence. He expects movement in the branches, a shadow crossing the fence, a sharp call from somewhere above that sounds less like noise and more like a warning. And the strangest part is that the pattern still holds. His brother can stand in the yard for an hour and nothing happens. The neighbors come and go with groceries, dogs, laughter, headlights. But when Caio appears, even quietly, the birds seem to know. Science doesn't give us a storybook answer, only a more unsettling one. Corvids do not need human emotions to produce human-like consequences. They learn. They remember. They compare. A jay that sees danger may not only avoid it later, but also broadcast that information in subtle ways the group can use. A crow that recognizes a face may hold on to that memory for years, passing the warning along through its social circle. In other words, what looks like revenge may actually be reputation. And reputation, in the bird world, can be as powerful as punishment. When Caio finally leaves food out as an offering, the atmosphere changes again. The crows do not rush in like grateful guests. They watch first. One lands on the wall, then another on the branch above him, both motionless, both staring with the cold patience of creatures that have survived by not trusting too quickly. Only after several minutes does one descend to the dish. It picks up a piece, tilts its head, and flies off without urgency, as if the message has already been received. Not forgiveness, not peace. Assessment. That is what makes this story so disturbing. We want animals to fit neat categories: harmless, aggressive, intelligent, loyal. But crows and jays exist in a sharper reality. They do not dramatize memory. They use it. They do not forgive in the way we mean it. They update the file. And if a human crosses the wrong line, the bird may never forget the face attached to the threat. So maybe the question was never whether birds can take revenge. Maybe the real question is how often we mistake intelligence for coincidence and social memory for superstition. If this case made you look at the birds outside your window a little differently, give the video a like. And tell us, if an animal remembered your face for years, would you call that revenge or just survival? If you want more investigations like this, subscribe, because the world above us may be keeping records we're only beginning to understand.